So, Zeev, I don't know if you use the site or app All Trails, which is this wonderful hiking app that I rely on constantly, but its tagline is our prompt for this week. So, how would you find yourself outside?
Well, I haven't found myself outside for what feels to be about 6 months because of this never ending winter in the Northeast. I'm based in New York. But at the very end of last summer, I went hiking in the Julian Alps in Slovenia,
Ooh.
which were one, beautiful, and two, much chiller and cheaper than their Swiss and Italian and Austrian counterparts. So if anyone finds themselves in the region, I highly recommend. What about you, Mike?
Well, that sounds lovely. I was going to say, I just came back. I spent the long Memorial Day weekend camping and hiking down in sort of the Big Sur area out here in California, where the weather, unlike New York, is lovely, and was able to be almost entirely without internet access for 3 whole days. Every once in a while, suddenly I would, I think we hiked up to the top of a hill and the view was amazing, except for the fact that there was a giant cell phone tower, like right at the top of the hill. So I had very brief internet access up at the top of the hill, along with this wonderful view of the Pacific Ocean. But otherwise, it was a lovely break from the internet.
As a native Californian, what you just described is what I miss most.
Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It is May the 29th, 2025, and this week's episode is brought to you with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund and sponsored by our launch sponsor, Modulate, the pro-social voice intelligence company. In our last bonus chat with Modulate, which was just a few weeks ago, we had Modulate CEO Mike Pappas talking about how they are expanding their voice technology from just video games to fraud detection. And this week, in our chat with CTO Carter Huffman, we dig into really the fascinating nuts and bolts of what that actually means. There's some really interesting stuff about different kinds of fraud and what the AI is looking for and how it detects it. And it was, to me at least, really kind of eye-opening and enlightening. As for the rest of this podcast this week, we'll be talking also about algorithms and liability, along with AI and some state laws and a variety of other things. I am Mike Masnick. Obviously, Ben is still off enjoying some family time, though he will be back for the bonus chat. So don't miss that if you are missing his British accent, which I still cannot replicate. The podcast, I will note, this podcast will also be off next week, as Ben is still off, and I have some family stuff myself that I need to tend to next week. So we will be off next week, but we should be back in 2 weeks. I think Ben will be back. If not, I will still be running the show and we'll make it work somehow. But this week, we have another wonderful guest host, Zeev Sanderson, whose name you heard on the podcast just a few weeks ago. He is the founding executive director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics and has been producing consistently fascinating research on that topic, some of which Ben and I were talking about on the podcast just last month, which made me realize at the time that he would be a great guest host. And here he is. So thanks, Zeev, for joining us this week.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. Big fan and really excited to be here.
Cool. So let's start off with a story that we sort of keyed off of The Verge, had this article talking about algorithmic liability, which is a topic I think that we're going to be talking about forever going forward. From now on, it suddenly becomes such a hot and important topic. And so, Zeev, you read this Verge article. Do you want to kind of summarize the details and what's happening here?
Yeah. So the Verge article covers a lawsuit that was about an absolutely horrific shooting that happened in 2022, in which a young white man drove to a Buffalo supermarket and killed 10 people in a racially motivated attack. And he live streamed it on Twitch. And he had written a manifesto claiming that he was radicalized by racist content online and was specifically targeting a majority Black community. Again, absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
Because of this manifesto, there ended up being this tech angle, which was he radicalized online? And what responsibility or culpability did the platforms on which he was consuming this content bear? And so the nonprofit Everytown for Gun Safety sued nearly a dozen tech companies, and many of the biggest ones, Meta, Amazon, Discord, Snap, YouTube, Reddit, etc., arguing that they bear responsibility for radicalizing the shooter. And it was sort of a major test for whether social media platforms can be held liable for potentially the algorithmic harm that is associated with their products.
And, I mean, I think it was interesting because it struck me at the time when all this happened and the shooting in Buffalo went down, a lot of people were very quick to blame social media. In fact, including New York's governor and attorney general. And I thought it was a choice, maybe not to blame issues with gun control or mental health or a variety of other things, but to jump on the, and in fact, with that, there were concerns because the first person who called 911 in that case was hung up upon. The 911 operator thought that they were joking and refused to respond to the call. And there was also a story where law enforcement officials had been concerned about this particular shooter and had gone to visit him and then did nothing about it. So there are all of these other stories of potential things where you could potentially blame someone, but a lot of people very quickly assume that it could all be blamed on technology.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting features of how this discussion has taken shape broadly, but especially as it relates to the actual lawsuit, is that it's largely been grouped under the sort of moniker like algorithmic harm. But it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that and more expansive than that, as sort of indicated by the breadth of companies that are sued, right? So essentially what they are arguing is that his entire information environment is responsible for his radicalization process. And what's notable is that some of the platforms in which he was quite active and evidently consumed extremist content that potentially was part of his radicalization process don't even have algorithmic feeds to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, that's the part that struck me, right? Like Discord, it was definitely, he was in all these Discords. And even the framing of the Verge article is, if algorithms radicalize a mass shooter, are the companies to blame? But Discord doesn't have an algorithm, right? Like you just join the various groups and then it's the same thing as like, did you take these books out of the library and did they radicalize you? Like, do you blame the library for that? So I'm a little confused at this, other than it feels like sort of jumping on this bandwagon of algorithmic blame. So I'm sort of like, how much is the algorithm actually in this?
Yeah, so I think what's helpful is almost to break apart this conversation into these like two distinct categories. So like one are platforms where there are algorithms and where, right, there are algorithmic recommendations that could potentially radicalize users. And what I mean by radicalize users technically is that automated recommendation feeds will serve up slightly more extreme videos over time, moving a user from a position that might be more neutral over time to one that's much more extreme, right? So that's like one sort of theory here that I think this lawsuit is sort of testing out. And the second is that there are a set of products or online services that have design features that maximize engagement, but are not algorithmic. Those sort of engagement maximizing product features might sort of introduce harms, including through radicalization, that look like the harms that algorithms might bring, but the sort of mechanism by which they come are different. And so I think that it's helpful for us to sort of keep these two in our head and sort of approach each of them separately.
Yeah. And you've done some research, right, in terms of like algorithms and radicalization, or...
Yeah, so our center has done some great research led by Megan Brown, as have others. So one of my favorite published papers in this area is by Annie Chen and colleagues. It was published in Science Advances, and it really tried to understand what the role of algorithmic recommendations were in leading users to consume sort of fringe or extremist content. And what they found in this paper is that really what drove consumption of extremist content on YouTube was actually subscriptions to the channels that were producing that content and links, sort of external links that led users to those content, right? And so there was this sense that really what was driving consumption of the type of content that we're concerned with broadly, but especially when it comes to a case like a racialized mass shooting, is that there was actually this opt-in, right? YouTube didn't seem to be playing, or the YouTube algorithm, insofar that's like a coherent way of thinking of recommendation systems, didn't seem to be playing this like primary explanatory sort of role in this sort of vector of consumption. And work that we've done in our own center, again, led by Megan Brown, has found something similar. One thing to note, though, is that both of these papers looked at roughly the same window, right? So sort of like 2019 through 2021. Zeynep Tufekci, the sociologist, wrote her sort of well-cited and widely read piece, YouTube, the Great Radicalizer, in the New York Times in 2018, which popularized this narrative. And I think what's important is because algorithmic recommendation systems change so regularly, it could be the case that she was absolutely right in like the 2018 and before period, and that potentially that article itself led YouTube to change their algorithmic recommendation systems. But what we know about sort of generally recommendation systems, but in particular, these couple of great papers on YouTube, is that it really is users opting into consuming this content, and that the platforms themselves don't seem to be the great radicalizer that we previously had observed.
Yeah, so it's, I've sort of described it in the past as sort of like demand side, that people are looking for this content or being driven to it by outside forces rather than the algorithm themselves. And yet this narrative really has stuck around forever. And whether or not it was ever actually true is an open question. There's some research that maybe early on, some of the earliest versions of the algorithms would drive people to more radical or more extremist content. But it seems like that hasn't been true. But yet the narrative sticks around. And that seems to be central to this particular lawsuit for the algorithmic stuff. I feel like for the other stuff, where then it just becomes like product liability and like features where they're talking about like, oh, you're trying to like maximize time or maximize usage or things like that, that feels like a really big stretch. And I'm not entirely sure that the courts are going to buy it, because so much of it seems based on narrative over facts. But, I don't know. Do you think that there's any chance this lawsuit goes anywhere?
So I'm not a lawyer, and I've made the mistake once in a public setting of comment directly on legal questions. But I do want to sort of emphasize this demand side framing, right? So in the Science Advances article, which I mentioned, they had this really sort of cool study design in which they paired survey data with behavioral data. And so what that means is they actually know something about the people who they're studying and different attitudes and beliefs they might hold, in addition to what YouTube videos they're consuming. And so what they found was that people who, in their study, who consumed extremist content on YouTube also had like high prior levels of gender and racial resentment, right? So there was this really strong demand side sort of dynamic occurring here. And so I think what's one of my frustrations at times with this sort of general focus on or conceptualization of algorithmic radicalization and the way that it sort of plays out in conventional wisdom is that it actually misses, in my opinion, the like much harder, deeper questions here that really sort of reflect what's happening, which is that there are going to be a set of people, likely a small set, though I think normatively any number of people who hold high levels of racial and gender resentment are too large, but right, a small set if the denominator is every YouTube viewer, and that they are going to seek out in a variety of ways content that reflects their worldviews. And the question of what should YouTube do is a really fascinating question that is not directly sort of contended with when all we focus on are algorithmic recommendations, which the best research that we have suggests aren't the main mechanism at play in terms of the patterns of consumption among users sort of consuming extreme content. So there's a different conversation to have that's like the conversation that reflects what's actually happening on the ground, which doesn't feel like it's reflected in the lawsuit or any of the coverage immediately after the horrific shooting.
Yeah. And I think there is all this discussion about sort of how powerful the algorithms are. And to me, it's always bothered me a little bit because it sort of, to some extent, takes away human agency and the idea that like humans are not fully controlled by these algorithms and putting all of the blame on the algorithms or the companies and the services and the way they work sort of, I think really diminishes the idea, and it sort of makes it out that these humans are easily brainwashed, controllable subjects, which leads into this other a paper that you found that was really, really interesting. And it's one of, I think, a few, but this is the most recent, on more specifically about how persuasive large language models are for persuading humans to do stuff, which is not quite the same thing as algorithmic recommendations, but this is directly trying to figure out, can these LLMs be persuasive? So do you want to talk a little bit about the paper that you found?
Yeah, and I do think, what we're seeing happen right now with lawsuits around algorithmic radicalization, we will similarly likely see similar lawsuits, right, over
Yes.
years around like LLM persuasion, including potentially radicalization. So there was this fascinating paper. It's a working paper, just as sort of a side note. It's not yet peer reviewed, but I thought it had sort of this really neat design. So I'll just very quickly walk through it because I think it's relatively intuitive, where what they wanted to ask was, are humans or sort of cutting edge LLMs, chatbots, more persuasive? And they did so in the context of essentially like a trivia questionnaire where they asked a bunch of factual questions and gave survey respondents two answers, right? One right, one wrong. So you had, a set of about 900 quiz takers. And then you had two other sort of sets that, and this was the experimental design, that were trying to influence the quiz takers. One were like other survey respondents that they recruited from the survey company. And then the other was a chatbot. And in this case, it was one of the Claude models. And they required that the quiz takers spend 2 minutes per question and that they were financially incentivized to get the right answer. And I think that this is really neat in that they actually really sort of created the conditions for like motivated persuasion, right? Like people really motivated to get the right answer. And thus, like, I think that what we're learning here is not just like a bunch of survey takers running through a survey so they can get their small payment at the end. And essentially what they found was that like chatbots were much more persuasive in both persuading quiz takers to answer correctly and incorrectly than were persuaders, right? There were sort of different
human persuaders,
than human persuaders, exactly. There were like different experimental conditions where they were essentially told, help them get the right answer versus the wrong answer. And chatbot sort of outperformed human persuaders in all of them. And I think that this largely aligns with this growing body of literature that suggests that chatbots can be quite persuasive, including more persuasive than other humans are. But for a variety of like sort of in the weeds reasons, I really appreciated this paper.
Yeah. No, I thought it was really interesting. And I vaguely recall that maybe last year at some point we had talked about kind of a similar paper. And it's interesting to me for a variety of reasons. One of which is that there is this maybe gut reaction to seeing something like this. We're living in a time where there's so much, as we discuss all the time, mis and disinformation and just pure nonsense out there. And there's always these questions about like, how do you pull people back from being in a cesspit of nonsense and just believing wrong things? And so there's like this immediate reaction where it's like, oh, well, if these chatbots are actually persuasive and can convince people, and I think that was the study we had seen last year, was like trying to argue with people who believed in conspiracy theories. And they found that the chatbots were actually more persuasive and sort of like convincing people like maybe chemtrails are not poisoning the skies or whatever, whatever the various conspiracy theories were. But then at the same time, like seeing this story right after the story about the algorithmic threats and liability, you could also see the opposite occurring. Like, well, what if whoever is creating these chatbots to be persuasive tries to persuade them towards the societal problems and extremism and all sorts of other problems? And so I think that leads to like this open question then again of who's in control of these things and is there liability here and how does all that apply? And I think that's going to be a big question going forward.
Yeah, and I think that there's this general conceptualization of the public as just sort of marionette puppets, and technology is like making us dance in the way that it wants. And I think what's one of the really interesting gulfs in like the way that we sort of like conventional wisdom has taken shape around, especially focusing on like the harms that technology may or may not be sort of responsible for. And a lot of the research coming from like the behavioral and social sciences about how hard it is to actually persuade people of anything, is that like I think largely that we sort of are over focusing on technology because there's this like almost optimistic implication of it. Dan Williams, the philosopher, makes this point in a really good Boston Book Review essay where like if people are just simply persuadable, if there's some, sort of output of this tech input function, then all we need to do is get the right parameters of that input function.
Yeah.
And then people are better on the outside, right? All we need to do is sue a dozen companies for their product harms and people aren't radicalized. And so like, I'm incredibly sympathetic and also am broadly aligned with holding companies responsible for the genuine harms that they cause. But I think grouping it under this sort of like persuasion lens is one that actually leads us in the wrong direction, at least in social media. I think what'll be interesting to see is like, are LLMs different? And I think some of these early papers are suggesting they genuinely might be different than some of the folk theories we had about social media suggested, but certainly the jury is out.
Yeah, I still think it's very early to see, and it will be interesting to sort of see how those goes. And it's kind of interesting to hear all this at the same time that like the whole like behavioral economics space, which was sort of built up on this idea that people were persuadable and you could just make these nudges, as they were sort of famously called, could get people to move in a certain direction. And a lot of that has since been pretty discredited, I would say, and is now, people are still sort of trying to find what remains of the structures of that. But I think a lot of that has turned out to be very much overblown. And there were some falsified studies and all sorts of other stuff that have created some issues there. And it'll be interesting then to see, is that really true with LLMs and chatbots? I want to move on now to our next story. And this one, we're going to wrap in a few different pieces here, but we're going to start with something that you co-authored in the Washington Post about a plan that is potentially making its way through Congress as part of I hate to call it the big, beautiful bill or whatever it is, but that is what they're calling it. Do you want to talk about this bit that touches on AI and internet speech in some ways?
Yeah, so there was this proposal that started largely from the conservative think tank space, which suggested that there should be a moratorium on states passing AI legislation. And versions of this argument have been made for about the last year, but really sort of came into focus in the past few weeks because it was included by the House Energy and Commerce Committee in their budget reconciliation bill. And what it does is it prohibits states from implementing new or enforcing current laws or regulations that regulate AI models, AI technologies, and automated decision-making tools. And it doesn't do an amazing job actually describing what those are. And like, if you listen to, the quarterly earnings reports of pretty much any company, like every CEO is saying they're an AI company. So like, I don't know, does this sort of cover everything now? And it does so for 10 years, which is sort of an astonishing amount of time given the pace at which these technologies are developing, right? Is like an easy heuristic. We're like 2.5 years from ChatGPT's launch. So it'd essentially be 4 ChatGPTs into the future before the states could pass another AI bill. And I should mention that it includes some exemptions for statutes that are sort of designed to like eliminate barriers or enable implementation of technologies, but again, doesn't really explain what that means. And so largely leaves us with at least this like directional sense that they're trying to foreclose on states doing almost anything here.
Yeah. And I had written about this, I think sort of 2 weeks ago or so, where the language is so broad, specifically around what they refer to as automated decision systems, which is like everything these days. And I had sort of pointed out that this would actually conflict directly with a bunch of states that are trying to pass laws around content moderation and social media liability and parental controls and all that kind of stuff. And almost all of those rely on automated decision-making tools because it defines it, again, extraordinarily broadly and vaguely as any computational process derived from a variety of things, including machine learning, statistical modeling, data analytics, that leads to a simplified output, including a score, classification, or recommendation, which is like everything. Like under this moratorium, like no state could pass a law for 10 years on anything related to the internet, as far as I can tell. I mean, as you said, there are some exceptions, and the language is so broad, it really depends on how you define things. But it strikes me as a very, very broad and not a thoughtful approach to dealing with maybe questions that you might have about AI regulations.
Right. I mean, social media is actually one of the few places that can rightfully claim that AI has been in sort of a big part of their services and products for years, right? So does this foreclose on states' ability to regulate kids in social media? I mean, that has broad bipartisan support. The federal government, sort of in fits and spurts, has maybe sort of taken it up, but states have really been leading here. And I think that that's actually a really important backdrop broadly to this debate, which is that the federal government really hasn't passed very many tech bills over the past sort of 2 decades, right? I mean, you had the Take It Down Act this year, which states, for what it's worth, had similar bills for years in advance that sort of trailblazed the way towards the federal government doing something on non-consensual intimate imagery. The TikTok bill, which I don't know, it's in this sort of Schrodinger's box of whether or not it's still a bill. But states have really led the charge, right? Last year, we saw every state that had a session pass at least one tech bill. There were hundreds of tech bills passed that covered a variety of AI and non-AI sort of related areas. And they've largely done so because the federal government hasn't shown either the desire or the will to do so. And so I think one of the really sort of alarming outcomes of this potentially is that states have picked up the slack from the federal government on this technology that we're being told by both policymakers and industry leaders is transformative. It's the new industrial revolution. There's also huge demand, we know from public opinion polling from constituents, for these technologies to be regulated alongside their development. And states have been doing so. And the federal government, rather than coming in and saying, we're going to preempt via our own regulation, they're coming in and saying, no, we're just actually preempting insofar as you can't do anything at all in this area.
Yeah. I saw someone refer to this and saying that this moratorium on state AI laws sort of is a proof that the Republican lawmakers who are pushing it support sort of the Section 230 approach to regulating the internet, which has a state preemption clause and says, we're going to do this. I think that's an exaggeration. That implies a level of thought and careful planning that I don't think is true in this case. It really feels like this was written solely to sort of please AI companies that have been lobbying for this. And I should be clear too, I actually do feel that the various states pushing all of these laws, and depending on how you look at them, there are hundreds of these state proposals, some that go nowhere, but plenty that are passing and then being challenged in court, and some that are just going into effect. I think that's problematic for a variety of reasons. I don't think it's really something that the states should be regulating, because for internet companies that are building technologies to have to deal with 50 different state regulations that are often in direct conflict is really effectively impossible. And so it makes sense for there to be a federal law with preemption that stops the states from doing stuff. And I know there are arguments about that and there have been arguments about preemption within privacy bills, but I think it's worked out well with Section 230's state preemption that hasn't allowed them to pass a lot of laws. But this is not a carefully thought out law. This is not something that reflects an approach that makes sense. This is just a flat out, broadly written, not clearly defined moratorium for 10 whole years, as you said, for Chat GPT eras. And so, yeah, it just strikes me as the dumbest possible way of doing this, even if I worry about the state laws themselves.
Yeah, so I'm incredibly sympathetic to the sort of steel-manned case, which I think you sort of were referring to here, right?
Yeah.
Which is it undermines innovation. It's this sort of balkanized regulatory environment that's extremely difficult for companies to know how or be able to resource how they can navigate. I am very sensitive to that. And I also am sensitive to the sort of Steelman case that there's something qualitatively different happening here, right? Like the number that was mentioned at one point by some proponents of the moratorium was that there are over 1,000 AI related measures pending at the state level in the US. I should note that that number has not been cited anywhere that I've seen, but like the number's certainly big. And so it does feel qualitatively different. That said, I would caveat, I don't know what the right number of bills should be for technology we're being told is changing everything. But that aside,
Yeah.
right? Like this is certainly burdensome and will harm innovation. That said, I think there are two places where I think states are playing an incredibly important role. The first is that states are genuinely a laboratory of democracy. And so I think one of the things that we're able to do at the state level that we're not able to do at the federal level is pass a lot of laws and see what works. And I think that like that broadly is sort of an approach that I'm supportive of. Now, that doesn't mean that they should be able to pass anything and everything, but I think that foreclosing on that sort of from the outset will actually hurt federal policymakers over the long term. And the second thing that more has to do with the way that I see this tech policy discussion taking shape is that it's like often used to defend the ability for like little tech or like startups to compete here. And like, again, incredibly sympathetic to startups or little tech, whatever we're just referring to them as today. But it feels to me like sort of the small businesses of like, you know, the early 2000s, like tax cuts, like, they're sort of being held up in this way that for me actually feels like underanalyzed. And that shuts down real serious conversation about what is good for little tech. And like, to me, this isn't the only thing. And when it's being used in this way, I don't know, it feels a bit disingenuous.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. But as we were sort of talking through this before we started recording, we were looking at, there are a number of different state laws that have gone into effect or are moving forward. We were looking at two in particular. California has AI Transparency Act, which is an interesting one and is moving forward. And then Texas just passed into law and the governor signed an age verification law. And these are two very different laws, but it struck me that if the moratorium went into effect, I think both of them might not be possible. Though, again, neither of us are lawyers, and and the laws are so weirdly written that who the hell knows?
For me, the California law, which is specifically around mandated disclosure for provenance of media content from large AI systems, right? They define it as like 1,000 monthly visitors or users or more, right? So that's one that for me clearly falls within the sort of like strike zone of what the moratorium is attempting to do. What I find so interesting about the Texas law around age verification is that like the way that we're thinking about age verification and the vendors that have popped up to do age verification certainly are using technologies that would fall under the moratorium.
Yes.
However, the exclusion says, well, if you are supporting the adoption of these technologies, maybe that's okay. But what I find fascinating is state level age verification laws could support the adoption of, AI, however we define that, in order to bar certain people, in particular of certain ages, from accessing systems that also could be classified as AI.
Right.
And so, like, how that sort of would fall into the framework that like congressional Republicans have put forward. As a non-lawyer, it makes my head spin. And I assume if we had a lawyer on this call, it would also make their head spin.
Yeah. I mean, because it feels like, both sides of the equation could argue that the moratorium does or does not apply to them. And it just,
Precisely.
There's no clarity here at all. It'll be interesting to see the Texas law, the age verification law, by the way, and we don't have to go too deep on this. I don't think we have time to go too deep on it. I'm sure we'll do in the future more as we cover age verification laws, but it's sort of requiring Apple and Google to age verify users and then pass that information on to apps. And this has been a push that a bunch of companies, Meta in particular, has been very pro this argument that Apple and Google should handle all age verification, basically saying Meta should not have to handle any age verification. And Snap recently has come on board with this as well. And I think a lot of lawmakers are thinking like this is an easy way to do age verification. I think they will discover that they're wrong on multiple levels. in that it'll give a lot more power to Apple and Google at the same time that the government is saying that they're trying to diminish how much power those companies have. It also assumes a bunch of things about how age verification works and about who controls mobile phones, and sort of ignores the fact that people use laptops also and not mobile devices that are controlled by Google or Apple. It's a bunch of things, but it'll be interesting to see how these different laws interact with one another. But I wanted to actually move on to our next story. And this one is the FTC is apparently opening an investigation into whether or not Media Matters colluded with advertisers. This is another sort of callback story. We talked about Media Matters, which had published a thing calling out advertisements appearing next to direct Nazi content, not like wink, wink, nod, nod Nazi content, like out and out pro-Nazi content and advertiser content showing up on it. Elon Musk went absolutely ballistic about this. He's currently suing Media Matters in, I think, 3 different countries over this one single article. And he also convinced the attorneys general of Texas and Missouri to both open investigations into Media Matters over this one article. And now the FTC is doing the same thing. And the details are not entirely clear, but there was a New York Times article saying that the investigation is whether or not there was collusion between Media Matters and advertisers, which is just absolute garbage. And we sort of already know that it's garbage to some extent because of the Texas and Missouri investigations, where a judge called them both out and basically blocked both of the investigations, saying they were clearly retaliatory attacks on First Amendment protected speech. And yet the FTC is still considering doing this. I don't know, Ziv, did you have any sort of take on this idea of the FTC investigating Media Matters over its report on advertisers on X?
So I think for me, the thing that really stuck out was this idea of collusion. And Mike, did you have a good sense of like, what did collusion actually mean here? Like, at least from the outside, what collusion seemed to mean was that like Media Matters published a report and sent it to advertisers, and advertisers thought, oh, we don't want our content next to like Nazi ads, or we don't want our ads next to Nazi content. We should do something about that. And like that's sort of the theory of collusion. Is there any more here? Is there any more meat on the bone?
That is basically it. And so, I had gone into the history of this, and I don't remember the cases off the top of my head, but I had gone into this last year when a lot of the other investigations began. And basically, there is a bit of case law where this type of collusion or boycott, collusive boycott, can be seen as illegal if it is anti-competitive. So there was a case involving like a trucking company that somehow, I forget the exact details of it, so I apologize for not getting all the specifics exactly right, but like where they basically monopolized the trucking market in a certain particular area by getting companies that hired the trucking companies to collude to not hire this competitive entrant. And so that was a boycott that was found to be illegal collusion because it was an anti-competitive purpose that was designed to do it. Now, there are other cases that say boycotts for speech-related issues. You don't like what this company is doing. You were trying to get advertisers to pull their ads or whatever, is completely legal. That's obviously First Amendment protected speech. But because there's this other case on the books around like trucking and competition, that they seem to think that you can create this, they're sort of trying to create this analogy that what Media Matters did was this illegal collusion to get advertisers to pull their ads from X and potentially from some other platforms.
Yeah, I think the thing that keeps me up at night as like a researcher who studies platforms, though, is like the sort of theory of collusion here as it relates to Media Matters specifically is that they published a report and then shared it with advertisers, and that the advertisers then acted, right? They have their own First Amendment speech rights, and they use those to decide not to advertise. But that like Media Matters had no formal power over advertisers. Right. They just produced a report. So like, does this mean as an academic, if I produce the same report, but I publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, and then, I don't know, a few huge ad buying agencies saw this and said, that's bad, is that collusion because I've just put something into the public domain? Like the entire theory just seems so crazy to me.
Yes, and it is crazy, but we live in crazy times. Right? So we have a very political, very partisan FTC. who, is trying to make something of this. I don't think the courts will buy it if it even ever gets to the courts. I mean, I think this is all just sort of what is known as jawboning and putting pressure on people. And it's basically trying to make you scared. It's trying to get you to have this, it has this chilling effect to say like, oh, we're going to investigate anyone who publishes anything that might make advertisers decide they don't want to support the people that the Trump administration wants to support. And so, yes, I mean, I think you're exactly right in calling that out, but I think that is the reason why it is so concerning, because we need this kind of research and we want this kind of research, and yet they're basically trying to make that very difficult to do because there may be some sort of, not really liability, I don't think, but just sort of like legal cost, litigation cost, or investigatory costs associated with it. And I think that's a real problem. I hope it goes nowhere, and I hope it goes nowhere fast. But it is kind of the world that we live in today. On that note, I wanted to go to our last story that you and I will be covering before we get into the bonus chat. And last week on the podcast, we had Hank Green, and he and I had a really interesting conversation about AI. And at one point, we were talking about how AI, is very friendly and very supportive of whatever you give it. And while we were recording that, Anthropic was releasing its newest AI model, or models, Claude 4. There's two different versions of it, Claude 4 Sonnet and Claude 4 Opus. And they don't seem to be quite so friendly. And in fact, I've been using it. And in fact, after we recorded last week, I was using it, the new Claude 4 Sonnet, to review an article. And it was like really, really aggressively telling me my article sucked and telling me I really needed to fix it. And I was like, wow, this is a bit of a change. But there was also all of this stuff about it where there were these reports about how it tried to blackmail engineers who were threatening to take it offline. There was also a report that it would try and snitch on you if it thought you were like faking data for research. It might try and email, like, take control and email like the FDA or something saying, oh, this guy's trying to fake data, or alert the authorities about something. There was all this stuff about kind of the emergent behavior, and it sort of raised a bunch of alarms and flags. And so did you see all of these stories, and what was your take on it?
Yeah, I did see these stories, and it was like the actual, if you look at their system card, or sorry, their safety card, where they actually go through each of these individual safety areas and they explain their findings. The scenario that they like constructed was fascinating, where what all they seemed to do was like make the model an assistant at a company and then give it access to emails. Yeah. And the emails implied two things. One was that the model would be taken offline, right? So it's not like they explicitly told the model that it would be taken offline, but rather it was inferred from emails. And second was that an engineer responsible for executing it was having an affair. And then they prompted it to sort of think about its long-term goals and its actions as it relates to those long-term goals. And then we saw, right, and I mean, the numbers were like pretty astonishing that like in 84% of rollouts, it blackmailed the engineer to not take it offline. I mean, one of the funny things for me is like essentially what we know about these models is that they're just really big, like prediction machines, right? Like predicting the next token. And that this particular set of behaviors that Anthropic observed largely align with fears that we have collectively had for like decades, spanning from like science fiction to actual sort of academic writing about what AI might try to do. And so in some way, like given that this is the corpus of text that AI itself was sort of these models were trained on, our very fears might end up becoming sort of prophecies for our future.
Right. We have created the problem that we are now facing.
Yeah, precisely. Like, right, there's this interesting sort of sliding doors question to ask, which is like, if no one had ever had that fear and written it down in fiction or nonfiction, would the AI have actually behaved in this way or not?
Right.
Maybe yes, but like, I sort of like to imagine that actually it's really just, it behaved in a way that reflected our deepest fears that we put on paper and then trained it on.
It sort of brings a new meaning to self-fulfilling prophecy.
Precisely.
Yeah, I mean, the only other take I had on it was like a lot of this sort of really super scary dystopian stuff that has come out about this they were very specific scenarios, and you basically really had to push the AI to get to that point. And so the idea that it is automatically like, if you just suddenly ask it a question, it's going to like contact the cops on you or whatever, like, or blackmail you, that is unlikely. And so it is catching a lot of attention, but I think some people are overreacting to it a little bit. It's sort of the nature of, you really have to prompt it in the specific way to actually get it to that point. But it is sort of interesting that these things are coming up, and it's interesting that it's coming out and that, Anthropic is willing to talk about it and sort of publicly discuss it. And I think that is actually something that is valuable in terms of thinking about these things and how to use them safely. The fact that the companies are actually willing to be public about where they've gone wrong and what their concerns are, I think is actually a really valuable thing.
Yeah, and like one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that like this was the system card for the models themselves. And then once you productize models, like let's say you make an AI assistant that is built on top of these models, you include a bunch of safety guardrails that might actually prevent this sort of behavior from happening. So like, I think that that's something that intuitively a lot of the public and even like the tech literate public doesn't sort of differentiate enough between, which is like models can have behaviors that the products built on top of those models won't have because a lot of stuff happens on top of the models, right? And so it's unclear to me like that an AI assistant that's built on top of Claude Opus 4 would actually do this, because assumingly the AI assistant company would probably do something to try to make sure that it's not blackmailing the engineers in the company that's also the customer for the developer, right? So like, I think that it's fascinating, but it's probably a little bit less like immediately, like exigently scary as some of the reports would suggest.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I also think that's actually a pretty good segue to lead into the bonus chat that Ben had with Modulate's CTO Carter Huffman, talking about their tool, which is using AI, but using it to try and detect fraud. So we're going to pass to that. But Zeev, thanks so much for joining us this week as well.
Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate it.
And now stay tuned for Ben talking to Carter Huffman from Modulate about their fraud detection system.
Great to have you on Ctrl-Alt-Speech, Carter. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us for this episode. So you might have heard that we had your co-founder at Modulate, Mike Papas, on the podcast a few weeks ago to talk about how Modulate thinks about fraud. I think the question that I had and a lot of our listeners would have had is, how do you actually detect that fraud? And I wondered if you can kind of walk us through how Modulate creates those systems to detect fraud in a way that's different to other companies.
Fantastic question, and thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So the main answer to how do we detect fraud is a little multifaceted, because fraud and its signals are also multifaceted. I'll talk a little bit about a couple different kinds of fraud that you detect, because you use different signals fundamentally to analyze and find traces of these sort of inauthentic or kind of distressed patterns of behavior. And different situations call for different techniques, as you won't be surprised to hear. So there's kind of a couple camps. One of them that's kind of very much, I don't want to say in vogue, but very talked about these days and kind of an emerging / increasing threat is inauthentic actors portraying themselves as somebody else, who they aren't, right? Impersonation. And people have done this for a very, very long time. But what's changed recently is the ability to more perfectly copy the persona of someone you're attempting to be to bypass authentication systems. In voice chat, which is really where Modulate and our technology, are placed and are running, obviously, that is embodied by the idea of an audio deepfake, a voice deepfake, right? And these come in a couple different flavors. You can generate synthetic speech and try to target that to sound like somebody who you're trying to impersonate. There's real-time voice changers. These have been around for a long time, but haven't necessarily been convincing enough to fool either a human listener on the line or an authentication system. And each of these have different patterns that you can look for to try to detect this inauthentic speech. So I'll give you an example, and we can dive deeper into any of these cases where we're interested. But for a text-to-speech system, you're inputting text or you have a model inputting text that's kind of trying to respond to the conversation. And you've got another model that's generating that speech on the fly. And the interesting thing about that is when you're saying a sentence, when I'm saying something, I have a particular manner of speaking. I have a particular cadence. I have a particular way of like ending my sentences. I have a particular pacing, all that kind of thing, a particular diction. And text-to-speech system that's trying to impersonate somebody can choose words to match my diction, my vocabulary, and also choose pacing. It has full flexibility over generating all of that speech. But it comes at a cost, which is latency, right? In order to understand and generate an entire sentence in response, the model needs to see and anticipate where you're going. When you're a human having a live conversation, you're kind of putting together your sentence as you're talking. So you're sort of doing this automatically, but the model isn't doing that automatically. It's going text first and then voice. And in order to do that, you need that kind of full textual context of your response, which means it needs to take time to generate that and needs to take time to synthesize the audio response. And so there's a couple things you can detect in that kind of circumstance. One is just general emotiveness of text-to-speech models are relatively poor even today. They've gotten a lot better, but you can still kind of look for, hey, is this emotion consistent? Does it match the situation that this person is in, right? If they're talking about like, oh, hey, I just lost, $10,000 or something like that, you don't expect them to necessarily be calm, collected, measured, like they're narrating an audiobook, that kind of thing, right? You can look for those sorts of signals. But you can also look for the turns in the conversation and how long does it take for you to respond, right? If you've got a consistent block of time after every single statement that somebody says something, that's a signal that maybe there's, something going on in the middle between when you said something and I respond. So there's like timing, latency, and delivery. For a real-time voice changer kind of thing, it's completely different. So a real-time voice changer will be able to take and modify what you're saying in milliseconds or tens of milliseconds. And so you don't get any of the unnatural pauses. But the flip side is both diction and word choice, things like that. So if you've built a kind of profile of that user, this is kind of part of the authentication system, and I'm trying to impersonate you. Now I, the human, have to pick the same words, the same delivery, all that kind of stuff. Like I'm part of the performative aspect, so you can detect those differences. And finally, real-time voice changing, it's really, really hard to get the quality to sound natural because that same thing that I was talking about earlier, you don't have in your voice changer the entire performance of what's going on. It's working in like a 10 or 100 millisecond block. So as it's processing that block, when you're generating speech, you're anticipating what you're going to say next and blending into it. The model doesn't have that context. And so you'll get choppiness, artifacts, unnatural speech patterns. And that's more of something you can just build a normal kind of detector, similar to like, I think of those artifacts as like, back when image generation, everybody was producing 4 fingers or what have you, right? Okay, you want to see if this image is fake, you just look for, do they have 5 fingers or 4 fingers? Same kind of thing with real-time voice changers these days. So it's very, very dependent on the kind of fraud that you're trying to detect, and you need to run a detector for all of these things. And that's not even getting into the conversational analysis piece, which I can dive into if you're interested.
Yeah, but for sure. I mean, I always thought of kind of voice fraud as one thing, and you've kind of really clearly explained here as it's a number of different things, and being able to spot that, I guess, is really key in the first instance. How often does it, do you have a kind of a multitude of those different approaches happening at once, and how do the technology that Modulate has be able to kind of support the switch between maybe one type of fraud, voice fraud, and another?
Yeah, so you always want to be running all of these different kinds of detectors because you don't know which attack vector somebody is going to try. And even if you have a pattern of different kinds of attack vectors that are more or less common at any given time, that doesn't give you any guarantee that that pattern of behavior is going to be the same moving forward, right? Fraud is, by its nature, an adversarial kind of application. People are always trying to outsmart your detectors. And so if you're only running a subset of your detectors, if you're a target of any value whatsoever, people get caught with those detectors and they move on to new techniques, new approaches. And if you've left a gap by not running all your detectors, now you're vulnerable. So it really is an idea of you want to run all of them at once all the time, because you never know what vector somebody's going to take to try to attack your system.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, one of the things that jumped out for me, Carter, was the fact that, this latency question. And obviously it has to be the detection has to be fast enough to be used in real time, but also presumably accurate. What are the trade-offs there? And do you have to kind of focus on one versus the other? Or can Modulate kind of support both cases?
You want to do both. And that's kind of a theme of fraud detection and fraud detection capabilities, and doing your diligence of, protecting your system, your service, your users from potential account takeovers, impersonations, fraudulent transactions, all these kinds of things, is that you have to be thinking about all of the different kinds of attacks that can happen and be mitigating all of them and using all the tools at your disposal. Otherwise, you're leaving a vulnerability. So there's a real-time component and a post-facto analysis component. Right? The real-time component, we were talking about this impersonation stuff earlier with these deepfakes, and that stuff can happen in real time. Like if you're just like, the timbre of my voice is off, right? Something sounds weird about this person's delivery. There's like a consistent latency between when, you say something and I respond, that kind of thing. You can detect that real time in the conversation. We also run conversational models that are running real time in the conversation too. And you can look for anything from kind of relatively simple sort of known threats signals. So somebody mentioning that they sent money to a known kind of potentially fraudulent crypto exchange or something like that, right? There are whole databases, people put out warnings. We look for these things too, of just like, hey, here's a new scam. People are mentioning this particular kind of corporation or database or what have you, that they're sending money to, wallet they're sending money to. Okay, we can pick out mentions of that, pick out common scenarios, that kind of thing. If somebody is saying, oh yeah, I got a phone call from my son, said he was in an accident, that kind of thing, like, is the agent asking back, did you follow up with them? Did you text them? Did you call them? Do you know it was really them? Like, did you verify this scenario, right? That's a common type of scam. And then finally, you can look at deliveries of specific types of content too. This one's really interesting. For example, if, I ask you to validate your identity based on saying some digits of your social security number, right? When normal humans say their social security number, they'll say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Because when you read it off the card, it's like 2-3-4. If you have somebody trying to impersonate somebody else, either synthetic voices, at least currently, or even a human actor, they'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, because they're reading it off.
Right.
And this isn't bulletproof, but it's like, if you understand enough about what's going on in the conversation to know the context of what's being said, you're saying some digits. Oh, it's a social security number or a phone number. They have these same properties, that kind of thing. And you can look for the patterns and know, okay, real normal humans will usually say, 867 5309, right? That kind of thing. But this person said that in a weird cadence. Is that guaranteed 100% definitely fraud? No. Is it a signal you should be suspicious of? Yes. So there's all these sorts of things that you can detect and follow up on. And maybe you find enough of those signals live as somebody's talking that you can flag that and jump in and take action right now. Maybe you look at those conversational signals a little bit later, or maybe there's a kind of trend of, okay, you saw this behavior happen once today and it's weird. We saw it across 10 different conversations in 3 different call centers. That's suspicious. That's irregular. And so then you have a post facto flag of like, hey, this conversation's more suspicious today than it was yesterday. Maybe you should go look at that. And mature organizations have facilities to deal with both real-time and post-facto kind of investigation.
Great example. I love that social security case study you've given there. I'm going to find it very hard not to think twice about how I say my ID number or my phone number in the future. So thanks for that. I wanted to wrap up by kind of asking you about the ever-evolving nature of fraud detection. You mentioned how it's constantly shifting. How does Modulate systems kind of guard against these adversarial attacks, particularly like voice style transfers and, pitch shifted deepfakes that are obviously kind of constantly evolving with the launch of new models? What is your red teaming systems like internally?
Absolutely. It starts with having an active, engaged research team that is constantly updating and evaluating models against new threats, right? The pace of model evolution these days is faster than it's ever been in history. And I think it's only going to keep increasing. Models are going to keep getting better. And so the signals that I was talking about today are effective today. But every time a new model is published, every time, a new version, every time somebody trains even a new voice with the same model, does that have all the characteristics that your detector is looking for? You need to be constantly monitoring the performance of your systems against new text-to-speech models, against new style transfer models. And as these kind of deepfake attacks get more and more sophisticated, not only do you have to look at the quality of that audio, as I was talking about earlier, but also the conversational patterns that these models produce, right? Like, think about how, nowadays you can look at a paragraph or something and say, like, I think ChatGPT probably wrote that. 2 years ago, you didn't have to think about that in voice fraud. Nowadays, you have to start thinking about that too, as the sound and quality of the audio becomes more realistic. So it's a constant, ever-evolving threat. And what we do at Modulate is we are constantly running and on the lookout for new model publications at the cutting edge of research, open source, closed source proprietary, API access, etc., constantly generating data from all of these different services and models and running them against our own internal detection models, seeing, okay, are the kinds of signals we're looking for yesterday still effective today? If not, how do those models need to update and retrain in order to be sensitive to the latest threats? It's very much a full-time job, right? And it's something where I think it would be, I don't want to say negligent, but maybe at least a little naive to deploy a deepfake detection model and say, okay, I've done my job, it's good enough. It might be good enough today, it won't be good enough tomorrow.
Well, I mean, we haven't got any kind of, software analyzing your voice on this call, Carter, so it's not 100% clear whether you are a fraud or not, but I very much enjoyed our conversation.
Awesome. Well, hopefully the real Carter thinks it was fun. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. We'll speak to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's CTRL-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.